Thank you again for joining us for Morning Coffee. We do this on the first Wednesday of every month. I'm Maryellen Burns, and I'm also an author. We're going to be focusing on writers today. I can never tell my right from my left. To my right is David Stuart, and I'll explain a little bit more about him in a few minutes. Christina Richter, Jill Stockinger, and Caesar Nelson. So who we have today is three mostly history writers, two poets, and a failed poet. And you can guess which one is which after we talk. But what I'd like to do from the very beginning is to turn this over to Dave Stewart. I will say that we have people that are on Zoom or watching this live. There is a mechanism if you want to pose a question in the chat. Sean Hidalgo, who is our director today, will read those out, and we have people in the audience will do that as well. So, but to introduce Dave Stewart first, David is somebody that I admire. He comes from the museum world. He was the executive director of the Sacramento History Museum. He was the former director. He was plugged in while they got their new person. He started at Mozak, and he was with the San Joaquin, I'm always going to get this one wrong, County Historical Society as well. And he serves with me at the Sacramento River Delta Historical Society. Together with other people in the Delta, we're trying to really capture a lot of Delta stories. There are so many people that are affiliated with ACC who that's where their family came from, including Jean Shiomoto. Her family was from Cortland. We're going to be capturing those stories, and we're going to be creating a journal, which we'll talk about later. But I'm going to throw it to Dave just to talk a little bit about how he started off in writing, his process, and what are some of the publications that he's done.
Thank you, Maryellen. Well, I've written my whole career as an anthropologist, archaeologist, and a park planner for the National Park Service. But when I became a museum director, then the writing changed because it was usually related to exhibitions we were doing. So, for example, at the San Joaquin County Historical Museum, which is between Stockton and Lodi, we did major exhibitions on the native peoples of the area, and I wrote a couple publications relating to them. There's a publication I did on earth-moving equipment because the County Museum has a large collection of caterpillars. A caterpillar company started in Stockton, and or other earth-moving equipment that had its roots in San Joaquin County, but also other ag history, for example, on the history of the mechanical tomato harvester, and so on. And those were, in some cases, publications by the Historical Society, but in other cases I submitted the research that drove some of these exhibitions. I submitted articles to some magazines that, if you're interested, writer, I think are really good sources to submit your material to. One is Joaquin Magazine, which covers primarily Stanislaus and San Joaquin counties, and it's bilingual. Now, I don't speak Spanish, but the editor of the magazine translated my articles, and I did a whole series on native peoples, but also a number of ag history articles. The other source that I'd really like you to take a look at was started by a friend of mine in Stockton. It's an online magazine called Soundings Magazine, and you can see it at online at soundingsmag.net. And it's a great source of information on the Delta, especially history and contemporary writing. So those are all really good ideas in terms of sources to go to. And my experience as a museum director and working on museum exhibitions is you have to do a lot of research to be able to focus on what are the main ideas, because the exhibit designers will tell you, you have 50 words here. And to decide what you're going to put in and what you're not going to put in, you really have to have a broad understanding of the topic. And that's why I ended up having material that I could publish, because you have to do that kind of broad research to do an exhibition. So that's those are some ideas for potential sources of to submit your works if you're an interested author. After I retired, I had another experience. I got to work on a local history book that with a friend of mine from Stockton, and I got to know him at the museum because he arranged for a lot of donations of historic photographs and artifacts to the museum. And some of those photographs were historical photographs of motorcycling. And so with my friend Stuart Barber Sr., we did a book on motorcycling in California's Central Valley. Now you'll probably recognize the look of this book because you've seen these. It's a series by Arcadia, and their series is called Images of America. They're photo driven. Our book has 215 historic photos, but it's a really good way if you're interested in local history, a neighborhood, a small town, or a community, in our case, the motorcycling community. It's a good opportunity to capture that history, which was my friend Stuart's his idea from the beginning. He wanted to save this history of motorcycling, which was so rich in especially San Joaquin and Stanislaus counties. But so if you're interested in doing one of these Images of America books, a couple things to keep in mind. One is you'll need somewhere like 250 photos, and you have to have permission to use those. And we worked ahead of time with the publisher and developed a form that especially Stuart got signed by all the donors. And about 90% of the photos in this book are from private collectors. They're not from archives or museums. So that's the first thing, because these books are photo driven. But they want long captions. There's not a lot of text, but they want long captions. So make sure when you're sourcing those photos to get as much information as you can. And I approached it like an exhibition, and first developed a history of motorcycling, and then we organized the chapters and the photos within the chapters and wrote the captions to tie in with that overall history that we had developed. So those are some tips. And then as you go in, you'll see that for these books, they have very detailed guidelines that really walk you through the whole thing and make it really easy if this, for example, is your first publication. Really make it easy to put the photos in place and the captions and develop the book. So now I've moved on, and I've just started work on what will be my biggest book. It'll probably take me 5 years. I'm working on a book that will address the indigenous people of the Bay Delta area, their cultures and their history, or history told from their point of view. And I've done a series of articles in Soundings Mag about that topic, but those were focused on the Delta, and I see there's so many ties between the Bay Area and the Delta that you really can't separate them. So now I'm working on treating it as one common area. And hopefully that'll turn out well. It's a challenge. I'm having to learn a lot about the other side of the Delta. I know this side very well, but that's been the challenge, to understand the landscape and the history of the Bay Area as it is connected to the Delta.
Great, thank you. So our format is that each one of the speakers is going to be able to talk. Then we're going to open up in a conversation, and anybody can ask anybody whatever question they want. Now I'd like to introduce Jill Stockinger, and she is, I am going to say it, well, she's not a former librarian. We talked about it earlier. Librarians are librarians until they end up in the last card catalog in the sky. She was with Rancho Cordova Library for the longest time, and I told her that I was going to confess. She is an excellent researcher. She's a poet. The events, the programs that she used to do at Rancho were better than almost anywhere. I'm plugging her because I think she needs to help the program committee here at ACC as well. But she provided a lot of material for me on Rancho Cordova. And the other day I looked at my Rancho Cordova file and realized I never returned it. So I'm going to be returning it soon in her honor. Jill is a poet. She is in a writing group that I should be a part of, and I'm not. She is going to actually talk about her process, a little bit more about her story, and she's going to read some of her poems. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you. As Maryellen has said, I'm Jill Stockinger. I was a librarian for 42 years. I studied poetry as an undergrad in college at NYU and then University of Wisconsin-Madison. But I've been writing since I was 7. My father wrote poetry, introduced me to haiku at a very early age, and I started writing haiku first and then just continued writing. I think the most important thing for anyone who wants to be a poet, who is a poet, and I believe everyone is a poet, whether you know it or not. We all have words to share. We all have something to say, and that's important just to write whenever you feel moved, to write when you're thinking about how to express something. And the more you write, the more accomplished you become, and it's also important to read other poets. The other thing is, for a poet, it's really important to find your community. So there are so many groups in Sacramento. There are so many groups all over. You can join groups on Zoom. I'm part of the Sacramento Poetry Center, and the one thing they do is Patrick Grizzell publishes a monthly publication called Poet News, and in it, it says lots of places for you to publish, to send out and submit your poetry. So the more you write and the more you submit, the more likely it is you will get published. Most poets that I know don't try to write their own book of poetry, at least at first. They send out their poems to be published in other magazines. So I've been published in around 9 or 10 small literary magazines. One of the latest is called Voices by David Bowles, who's from the Delta, and he does a lovely job. So I was published 2 years ago, and the newest one, he does a great job, but he mainly concentrates on publishing Sacramento poets. So that's a wonderful venue for Sacramento poets to try. It's David Bowles, and if he's always listed in the Poet News as a place to publish. So I definitely recommend, if you really want to be a poet and join a community, try the Sacramento Poetry Center. Also, I'm a member of the Renaissance Society, and they're my biggest group for turning to for suggestions and help on my writing. We meet every single Thursday all year long. It never ends, 9:30 to 11:30. So the Renaissance Society has several poetry groups, several writing groups, and they're a great source to turn to join and help you develop your writing. I also
I'm going to have a read, but I'm going to do a plug. We do have ACC and Renaissance are more and more doing programs together. We have quite a few Renaissance people in the audience, and this particular program, Morning Coffee, is listed in both catalogs, ACC and the Renaissance, and we'll be talking more about Renaissance through Morning Coffees as we go. But now I'm going to have Jill read.
So I'm just going to jump to, we often get asked, why do we write? And I wrote a prose poem about why I write. I write because the ancient white stag, ghostly in the gloom of the forest of mystery, knows my secret name and calls to me. His voice is like a medley of silver bells that fills me with an aching for all lost things. I need to find and to testify for those who are lost and for the things that are missing. I must give them back their voices and their names. I write or I die, as simple as that. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll have Jill. I have a lot of questions for her, but I'm going to hold them to the end. So now we're going to go to Christina Richter. And I always tell people that Christina has even more energy than me, and I think it's less sleep than me, very possibly. She is currently with the Placer County Museums, but she has been with every historical society group that I know. She's been doing a lot of work with the Fitiment Ranch. She'll be talking more about that as well. And she has written a couple of books. And she has, if I'm correct, you've actually done programs on writing, haven't you? Mm-hmm. For historians. So I'm going to turn it over now to Christina Richter and to thank her especially for coming all this way because she came from Roseville on that traffic today. Thank you, Christina.
Oh, thanks, Maryellen. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone in the audience on Zoom and in person. I've been around history for quite a while now. My background, however, is business. I have an MBA. I was partnering with my husband for many, many years to operate our business. We moved up here in 1997 from LA, and that's when I decided I want to really delve into something different. So by and by, I ended up being editor of Perspectives Magazine, which is a Placer County Arts Council magazine. I was executive director of the Sacramento Philharmonic for a few years. So I kind of jumped around. What landed me, however, was when I met a man named David Fitiment. And he and I decided that we wanted to write the history of his family. And his family goes back to early 1850s. And this is the result of that. It took me 7 years because they kept pulling out letters from hundreds of years ago with their family. I did a lot of research. And I would have to say the most thrilling part of the completion of this book was being able to understand fact from fiction. If you know anything about your family, you know that there's probably a lot of myths that have followed your family, a lot of fiction, a lot of perhaps embellished tales. So in doing this book, I was able to separate those facts from fiction, and the best part was being able to have the truth in print, and it's a wonderful, wonderful story. As a result of this, I became involved with the Roseville Historical Society. I was involved with that organization for about 10 years. Most of it I was president, and then also was vice president of Sacramento Historical Society for a few years. So I've been around. Latest and greatest is, as Maryellen said, I work for the Placer County Museums. We have 8 museums. I'm just there part-time. I'm technically retired. Yeah, well, we know how that goes. And I work with the archives folks, the collections folks, and I help to run the different museums. As a result of that effort, I have 2 things going on. First and foremost is the latest and greatest past and present Placer County. This is an Arcadia book, just like Dave's, but this is from their history press. And their history press focuses specifically on historical avenues and events, et cetera, et cetera.
Want to put it back up again?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So this was published May 1st. It's starting to get some traction. I've had one book signing at Barnes & Noble. That sold out in about an hour and a half. I have another one in November, which I'm happy to say I have a couple of more speaking engagements with this as well. And then last but not least, since July of 2019, I've been writing for Gold Country Media, and I am their monthly contributing writer for their history articles. And they are published in the Granite Bay View, which is distributed throughout Placer County. And I'm up to, I think, 56 articles now. So every month I do an article for them, and that in itself is quite the exercise. So my process of writing, I ascribed early on to Julia Cameron, The Artist Way. I do morning pages every single morning. Okay, a couple of times I don't, but for the most part, I'll take the time and do the page and a half, and that's front and back and a half, of full writing. And it's just basically a mind dump. The first part of it's going to be, okay, I'm thinking about this, this, and this, and you might have a couple of lines of, I'm just writing, I'm just writing, I'm just writing, and then the stuff starts to kick in, the good stuff. And by the end of that morning page, every single day, I come up with, oh, well, there's something I'm trying to figure out. Oh, well, there's another aspect of history that I really want to delve into and perhaps write an article about. So the journey has been wonderful. If you're a writer, continue to write every single day if you can. And as our fellow compadres here have said, when you're inspired, write. And I love the other aspect, and that is going on an artist date. And so after this forum this morning, I'm going to take myself on an artist date, and I'm going to go play somewhere in Sacramento, probably have to do with a historical site, and that'll be my artist date for this week. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Maryellen.
Thank you. I was really glad to have Christina because she has written a book about a family. And Arcadia books are far-reaching. There are thousands literally produced every year in every region of the country, and a lot of them are family stories. So if you have a family story that's interesting, and I have to tell you there are a lot of them that I've heard here at ACC, then, and I'm going to use Lana as a good example, Lana Chung, it is possible for you to actually produce something that all of us can read instead of something that just stays within your family. And now I'm going to talk about Clarence. I'm sorry. Caesar. I know it's Caesar. I just happen to know it Clarence Nelson as well. I have to be honest. I met him through poker. As everyone knows now, I have gotten, I'm going to out myself. Sorry, Sacramento River Delta Historical Society, but yes, I am here from 1 to 3 most Tuesdays, and down in the Delta now on Thursdays instead. And so I've gotten to know him, and then he just had mentioned that he was a writer and that he was a poet. I'm just getting to know him more. He is a journalist. He's in training here. So I'm just going to throw it over so that we can find out more about him. And I just want to thank him for his service to ACC because he's here every time that I am. Thank you.
Good morning,
thank you, Caesar.
Maryellen. Good morning, everyone. Caesar Nelson, a writer and poet. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time writing and speaking with a lot of people throughout this whole life. A lot of people have inspired me from college, from UCLA to Edith Lumpkin, it's UCLA English advisor, to Sacramento State University, Dr. Hornback and Dr. Redmond and Dr. Bertinosko, who these gentlemen here have a lot of insight on writing and teaching and things of that sort, and they have been very inspirational to me as a writer and basically being who I am. So, but we'll go back a little further as a kid, meeting the late Eleanor McClatchy growing up, and so that was a very inspirational situation, probably about 11 or 12, if not younger. So I'm just throwing that out. Who remembers dates, huh? Ages and things of that sort. So it was really funny, and with her, she had a great personality. And sometimes you see things that, as a kid, of everybody that's older and things of that sort. And I remember she mentioned one day you'll be working for the Sacramento Bee and the McClatchy organization, which I eventually did after college and stuff of that sort. Been published in writing in poet magazines and books throughout the United States. And so, like I said, it's been fun. I have a book here I wrote about 15 or 20 years ago called Poetry and a Pound Cake. Something different. I like pound cake. My mother was a great baker. So I wrote this, and I put the collection of poems together. And I'm going to read one. And you can put your own title on it, but I believe it speaks for itself. A sun dawns a new day. A ship docks at the port of call. A journey is as a destination when a course is set. People, citizens grow weary when promises are broken. They scatter like glass, shattered directionlessly, aimlessly. Be careful what you say to the citizens of America. When promises are broken, they are unforgiving like the oceans of the deep. Who knows when I wrote this, but I know it was like 20 years ago probably. But I know that the society, our society was in a peril, from politics to the social aspect of people being together in America. So that's where I believe where this poem came from. It's nice speaking with everyone today, and thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about my journey, then we're going to open it up where any of us can ask any of us questions and throw it out to the audience as well. So we probably knew each other. I was at Sac State as well. I started off as a music major, but they told me that I was never going to be able to pass piano, and it would take 7 years. So I went from musical comedy to journalism, and then had the same professors that he did in English. I was editor of the Sacramento State Hornet. Virginia and I knew each other. Virginia Uchita's in the audience from something called Alice's Restaurant that I will write about. But I wrote my first play at the age of 9. And I have been writing ever since. And I'm going to say that I feel the same way as Jill. If I don't know if I'd say I would do morning pages, because I probably write 5,000 words in any given day, just because. I started working in publishing. I graduated from Sac State, tried to get jobs in journalism. I got one job offer out of 200 newspapers, and I would have had to have done politics and obituaries and laid the paper out. Decided to go another route, and I ended up meeting a writer by the name of Richard Nelson Bowles, who wrote a book called What Color is Your Parachute? And publishing was always where I wanted to go. So even though it hasn't been my primary career, I have stayed in some form of publishing ever since, and writing. I probably helped 200 people get their work into print. Through that entire process, I was doing workshops on how to do it. I had 4 different publishers. I was doing West Coast promotions for all of the cookbook companies. I was asked to write books, and I always said, I don't have time. I don't have time. And then Jennifer Basie Sander, who some of you saw on Morning Coffee a few months back, called me up and said, I'm doing a book, and you've got to put something in it. You've got 6 months. So a month later she called, had written it. This went on until one morning on a Wednesday at 8 o'clock. She said, if it's not in by 5, you're going to do yourself a horrible disservice. So I sat down and wrote a story called Too Many Cats in the Kitchen, a humorous story, and literally turned it in by 5 o'clock that day. It ended up getting published in her anthology with very little editing, and it went on Google Books. Google Books did an excerpt, and I suddenly had publishers calling me, asking me to write a book. And as the saying goes, the rest is history. Never wrote the book I was supposed to, by the way. It's still something I'm working on. But I ended up doing a book called The Lost Restaurants of Sacramento and Their Recipes. And then through the libraries, worked with the I Street Press, helping again another 200 people get their books in print. And the last book is for ACC, The Foods We Share, the Stories that we tell, and we have some contributors in the audience. So that's just probably more than we needed to say. I do have some questions for individuals, but does anybody in the audience have a question first? Any? Okay, so I'm going to ask, oh, you do?
Was there an incident that shattered in your life that made you write your poem?
Well, probably so. Especially when it comes down to promises being broken. That is a very significant line there. Growing up, like I said, I met the late Eleanor McClatchy, and so she shared a lot of things with me as growing up, because we didn't live that far apart from each other. And I was involved, and my dad was involved with government and newspapers and things of that sort. So there was a lot of insight and things that she had mentioned to me growing up. As a kid, you don't really take it in that seriously. But as time goes on, things spark up, a light bulb comes on. It's like, oh, I remember what she said. And I'm looking right at that incident that's happening in America or throughout the world. And so that's probably how it came about. Thank you.
So I have, this is a horrible question because I'm obviously the failed poet. I have written 5, 4 of which have gotten published. But I was so downhearted because my favorite one never did that I stopped writing poetry. Why, and I'll ask for all of you, why you chose the particular process, why poetry is your means of expression versus nonfiction. And then I have a second question for the poets. Do you consider that creative writing? Do you consider it fact? Or is it fiction? Or is it a combination of both? So I'm going to throw it to the 2 poets first.
Usually, I look at poetry as emotional truth, that it has a special lens for looking at the world and pulling out, hopefully in words that won't be forgotten, in words that have strength and polish, important truths that are true for almost everyone. And I feel I've written short stories, I've written a play, I've done a lot of writing. I'm going to be honest, it's easier to write poetry. It's faster. And I think it's probably easier to get published, to be honest. But it speaks to me. My favorite poet is T.S. Eliot, and I love Bishop, I love Sylvia Plath. Poetry has always just spoken to me, and so I reply back in poetry.
Good. And how about you, Caesar? Did you want to address it?
Poetry has a lot of truth to it. A lot of poems do. And most of the time it's a reflection. It's probably poetry in motion probably has a lot more truth than some things, some literature. So I enjoy writing it. Like I said, it comes out with the truth. And it has some heartaches in it. And you can address those heartaches, and maybe someone else feels the same anxiety or the same happiness. That's the best part of it, too.
Good. And how about the 2 of you? How did you come to your particular means of expression through writing?
You know, I wrote poetry for a while when I was, my first writing foray was when I received a diary in 1st grade. And I'll tell you, that was amazing because I all of a sudden had a new way of expressing myself. And in 1st grade, you know, it's not particularly in depth, but it was a way. And I enjoyed that very much. And then started writing some poetry. I recognized all the names that you had. My favorite was of Rod McEwen. I was kind of a softie at the heart. And loved it. And I still have a book of poetry that I wrote in college that my daughters love, which is just a little insight into me growing up. And then went and made a living in business. Writing always called. And I did some marketing, writing, advertising, that sort of thing. And then history got hold of me. It had always been a hold of me, or had a hold on me, but when this man appeared in my life, David, And we started talking about his past and his family's past. I don't know what happened, but probably divine intervention that day, because we both just said, we've got to get this writing going. And then from there, I haven't stopped. And that was, this was published in 2013, and I started it in 2005, because it took about 7 years, and then a year to publish. So I think it's something that calls you. I don't necessarily know that you can drive it yourself. You can certainly have the discipline and rise up to the challenges and have the opportunities come around. But it definitely, for me anyway, it was a calling for my own self. And it continues to be as I write these monthly articles. Dave?
It's interesting because I wrote poetry and was an English major at Modesto Junior College. And the other thing that was very fascinating is that I took a lot of classes at the time was what was called Afro-American literature and Afro-American poetry. Got exposed to other cultures and subcultures. Had a lot of Latino friends that were writers. So I think that tied into my interest in anthropology. Plus, I was working in state parks and I got a chance to start doing campfire programs on Saturday nights for the campers on local history and especially Native people. So I switched my major to anthropology, but it's interesting that anthropology is really kind of between science and humanities. For example, in anthropology classes, it's all essay exams. You write all the time. So I think that's one of the reasons I was drawn to anthropology was the same things that pulled me to want to write, and especially to write poetry. I went to Fresno State because of the Fresno poets, and ended up switching my major to anthropology. So I was drawn to that aspect, and then of course later in my career I went into museums, and it's all about storytelling. Museums are telling stories, and as I mentioned, there's a research aspect because they have to be based in facts, but there's still a storytelling aspect too. And so I think that always appealed to me. And now working on writing primarily recently about indigenous people and cultures and history, I think it really gives me a chance to try to understand, cultures other than the one I grew up in. And so that's always been appealing to me. And writing about it, it just feels like the way to jump in and really understand those cultures.
Good. So this is going to be an odd kind of question roundabout. So for me, somebody who really inspired me was Langston Hughes. But it was a very specific book, and it was called The Book of Rhythms. And what he was able to blend was words and visual image and music, and jazz. And as soon as I saw that book, I thought that book has to be performed. And at the time, I was lucky because I was working with Kids and Senior Program, and we were able to, with the help of the seniors, produce it. So here's my question. For me, especially in poetry, but both of you are speakers. You speak everywhere. How do you separate out what I'm going to call the performance aspect of what you do in writing versus the soul of you're sitting in an empty room writing? Do you see those as two separate acts? Do you enjoy both of them similarly? And especially to the poets, to me, if you don't hear it out loud, it doesn't read the same on the page to me as seeing someone actually perform. So we'll start with Caesar at the end.
Well.
Or whoever wants to respond first.
Well, the performance is definitely really important because you become somewhat animated because there's certain words that have emphasis, that have a true meaning that touches the audience. It's really nice that you said something about Langston Hughes. I do remember Langston Hughes' poetry and Alice Walker and studying, as he had said, about the Afro-American department at these colleges. And I was introduced to a lot of their literature. I remember most of all Langston Hughes' of A Dream Deferred.
Of course.
Yeah. So, yes.
Good. So Jill, how about you for the performing part?
I'd say all music, all poetry to me is sound music. When I'm writing, I'm reciting it out loud. Anytime I'm writing a poem, I've said it out loud at least 40 times while I'm writing it, and I'm listening for the sounds. I'm listening for slant rhyme, for near rhyme, for actual rhyme. I'm looking for the vowels that match each other all through it. It must be sound music or it's not going to be my poem. That I feel like I perform it as I'm writing it, and that's an incredibly important part of poetry, is how it sounds.
Good. And I'm going to go to Christina and to Dave, and then we're going to ask our poets to read a poem each at the end. So, Dave, the performance part of what you do.
Well, it's interesting because I think it goes back to my comment that it's storytelling, and whether I'm writing, which has more facts, is more technical with footnotes and stuff, but I try to make that read as a story, and then I do perform, but it's different because I do, even with the motorcycle book. I promoted it not so much by going to bookstores and doing signings, but by going to historical societies and doing a PowerPoint program on the history of motorcycling. And I do PowerPoint programs on native cultures. I'm doing, 2 this month at historical societies, and I'm teaching 2 classes over in Brentwood at Los Medanos College on Native people. And so it's a different art form, but I think they're closely related because, again, I want the story, whether it's written or done in a presentation, to draw people in and pull them into the material. It's interesting talking about the sound of poetry. I read the autobiography of John Fogerty from Creedence Clearwater Revival, and he kept a notebook from way before the band started where he would write words or phrases that he wanted to use in a song because he liked the way they sounded. And the first thing he wrote in a notebook, that in the book they have a picture of it, was Proud Mary. He didn't have a song, but he just liked the way that sounded. And in his song about Lodi, Stuck in Lodi, he says the same thing. I'm not sure that's true because their band did perform in the valley. But he said, no, it was the sound of that word. It wasn't that he had any connection to the town of Lodi. But it was interesting. Proud Mary was written down because he liked the sound of it, and a song was built around it that became their most famous song.
Good. Christina.
Thank you. Aren't words wonderful? Words are wonderful. The sound of words are wonderful. Putting a sentence together, paying attention to its cadence, paying attention to the number of syllables in particular sentences and particular paragraphs. One of the things that I was taught is when you write, you start your paragraph beginning, middle, end. The next paragraph starts from where the last one left off. Very important to keep that in your writing head, in your writing space. For me, when I do historical presentations, it all depends on my audience. If I am speaking to a group at Sun City Roseville or Sun City Lincoln, and I'm talking to them about the Transcontinental Railroad, for example, what they really enjoy is are the stories that go outside of the main presentation. Well, let me tell you a little story about what happened over here when they were digging for the rails. Let me tell you about the neighbors who all came to lay the rails with all of their mules and their horses in Roseville. Those little side stories are the ones that I would call the performance. That's the meat of the whole thing, and that's what really keeps my audience engaged. In this particular book, in Placer County, Past and Present, my very favorite thing to do is, where in Placer County is this place? And what I'll do is I'll show the old picture first, and we'll have some discussion in the audience, and then I'll show the new picture, and I'll either get a, oh, what happened there, or a, oh my gosh, it's still available, or it's still around. That is also part of the performance. But back to the words. I love the words. And I love it that I wrote poetry when I was younger, because it really helps you fall in love with our language and with communication. And gosh, if we don't have communication, what do we have?
Good. So I'm going to do one question before I have the poets go. And it's because Jill is on one side of me and is such a tremendous editor. And that is the role. I mean, to me, and part of my process is that I just gush it all out on a page. I literally try to get it all done, and then I go back and I edit, because I find that if I edit as I'm going, it stops my process. But then I edit and edit and edit, and then I show it to somebody, and then they tell me where I'm going wrong. So I'm going to ask everybody where editing is in your process. And then when we answer that, then we'll go back to our poets who are going to read. So again, anybody want to answer that one? Christina first.
Editing is more important than writing. But the hard thing is the blank page. And just like Maryellen said, that's what morning pages are for me, is just the mind dump, if you will. And if I'm focusing on an article or a particular subject, I will just do a mind dump on it. I do try to keep in mind the continuous thought form and what I want to say, and oftentimes I'll have the main points of what I want to say written to the side so that I keep to the subject. Don't go off in the weeds, which we all do that, right? But I would say editing is more important than writing, and the scariest thing is the blank page, so just start writing.
Yeah, I agree, and and it really has helped me to have, I edit my own writing, but then to have somebody else, because some things you read, and because it's in your head, you can read it 100 times and you'll never see that there might be a clearer way to organize it or structure that sentence. And so that's what's really helpful, to have another person edit it in addition to your efforts. But I completely follow the same pattern. Get it out there, get the main ideas that you're thinking out in kind of the order that you may be thinking about, but then go back, do those ties between the paragraphs, decide if you need to divide paragraphs and make it clearer because there's 2 points in that one. All that stuff you can do after you get the main idea on the paper. So I definitely do that.
And how about the two of you?
I feel like I grew up almost learning editing at an early age. My father had a doctorate in business and economics. He wrote about 20 books. My mother was his main editor. She was a grammarian, and so I'd hear constantly all my life, there's a better way to say this, don't begin every paragraph with I, do this, do that, fix your verbs, this doesn't go this way, and it became part of my blood. So I edit a lot. I edit myself, I edit for friends. Right now, I'm really proud of editing Kiyosato's second book. She first wrote Dandelion Through the Crack, which won 15, 20 awards, $21,000 in prize money. It was a really major book about the internment of her family during World War II. And now she's writing a second book that starts where she ended, but it also has strong messages for the world of today to try to make sure such an injustice never occurs again. So I'm editing her second book, then I'm editing a book for her friend of an interesting teen romance between a Chinese American and a young woman whose family came over from India. And I edit Poet News. I pretty much edit for anyone who says, "Can you look this over?" And the editor in me takes over, and I can't help it. I just edit. So I'm a really core member of my Renaissance writing group. I edit everything they write and give strong suggestions. The editor in me exists while I'm even writing. Yes, it's really important to get the words down, but usually by the time I've hit my third line, I go, "No, that's not right." And so I do start editing, but it's important to get the words down. That's the first step, is get the words out and then go back and edit. And it's usually important to have other eyes on it to help polish. And often the hardest thing for a new writer is to change anything. They believe everything they've written is amazing and the world should take notice, and they don't know the mistakes they're making or how to say it better or where they're using words they've overused, etc. So editing is really important. Caesar?
Yes, editing is very important. You are correct about that, Jill. I edit a lot. I started out, in school on the newspaper. So you're writing and this and that. And your professors, they can tell they're really good at what they're doing. That's why they're in that position. Something unique and special about the talent. Caesar, you're going to edit. Okay, I'll edit. So anyway, I've done a lot of editing for newspapers and magazines, so it's pretty good. But as an English major, sometimes you just really do not like what the professor has just done to your paper. What? Did you really mean this, Caesar? Maybe so. So anyway, he goes, "I think you can just say this a different way." So that's how you really learn a lot about editing. And it's important. It really is important. It really helps. It helps the writer, helps the reader understand exactly what you really felt from your heart.
I'm actually going to make a comment about that one poem that I still rankle about. I like doing found poetry and found writing. So I will take work, and I took a 7,000-word essay on the revolution in Cuba and a museum in Cuba, and I turned that into a 27-line poem, only using the words in the 7,000 words, and I wanted it to be complete, where it literally told that story. And my problem with it was, and I won't name the editor because we all know him, said, "Oh no, you need to add a word here or there," and I go, "No." It wasn't in the book. But I performed that with some of the finest poets in Sacramento and got a standing ovation, I might mention. And so that's a poem that may never, ever see it published, but I'm going to perform it here someday. So we're now going to have you guys read a poem. Whichever one. You can go first, Jill.
Okay. I also wanted to say the fourth Tuesday of every month at Double Lotus Thai Restaurant, Bob Stanley, who is a past poet laureate, runs a poetry program from 6 o'clock to 8:30, and he usually has 4 or 5 poets perform, but at the end, anyone can ask to read 1 to 2 poems. So I read there almost every month, and I really enjoy it. And the poetry programs he puts together are phenomenal. So if you want to hear some great poetry and read your own poetry to an audience, do come to the Double Lotus Thai Restaurant, 4th Tuesday of the month, 6 o'clock, and we welcome everyone.
And where's that located?
It's near, it's Rancho, it's right near,
Rancho Cordova.
right, near Rayleigh's in Rancho Cordova.
Okay, good.
So I'm going to read you a poem, one of my poems that I really like. I hope you like it too, The Unicorn. I told them I'd ride a unicorn, but no one believed me. Not Julie or Anya or Nikos or Carlos, and especially not Alexander, who usually wouldn't even listen to me because I was a girl. One day, when I was alone in a field of sunflowers waving in the sun, a unicorn kneeled next to me. I climbed on, and we flew to green forests filled with blue and red and yellow birds with curved orange beaks singing in strange languages. We flew over oceans with waves that were 100 feet high that sprayed the white flanks of the mighty unicorn. The wings of the unicorn glistened, his violet veins pulsed, and we almost touched the sun. And I was filled with a special knowing I never had before. Suddenly I was splayed out back on the ground. "Remember this," said the unicorn solemnly. He placed the tip of his horn in my small freckled hand. It felt like silk. He bowed low and sang to me. Then I watched him spread his wings and take off. I told my friends I rode a unicorn and they laughed at me. I told my teacher and she said, "Stop making up stories." I told my parents. They said it must have been a dream. I told my little sister, and she grabbed my hand, and she whispered, "Next time, take me with you." And I said I would.
Oh, thank you.
Caesar.
Blossoms of the fall. Blossoms of the fall with sunshine. Leaves may fall, shower upon us, orange, yellow, blue, green leaves scatter with help from the gusty wind. Sun-ripe heat fall upon our hatless head. Only sunglasses protect those watery, sensitive eyes. Look, share the love of life. Leaves blown up by the howls of the wind's belly. Everywhere. Listen to our hearts. Hug.
Good. So they had a chance to read their poems. I'm going to give you guys a chance to say whatever you'd like, or to even read from a section if you want.
Let's see if I have anything here.
It's harder for history. Am I?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be a reading, but yeah, we'll go with Christina. She's faster than you.
I wasn't prepared.
Okay.
So the title of this book is called Walk With Me, I Want to Tell You Something. And my preface for the book was actually the story of that day when I took a walk with David Fiddimet. The man of 20 is quite different from the man of 50, and at 90, he's by far more different than at any other time in his life. As the pages of time turn, people change, and so do communities. Time tends to erase old landmarks, neighborhoods, and even entire sections of a place. One day I had the privilege of taking a walk with David on his old ranch property in West Roseville. The stately homestead brought a smile to his face, and his descriptions of the past were animated. He recalled where the dirt roadways on the ranch used to be, and where the buildings that once housed the lifeblood of the Fiddimet family used to stand. As we approached the proud old home, he quickly told me everything, as though he might suddenly forget. The well was right here, and the garden was just beyond that fence, he said, as clear as if it were yesterday. Then he went on to describe the cooling shed and the smokehouse, speaking with pride and a hint of longing for those younger days on the ranch. He made sure that I understood that both of these old brick buildings had been an integral part of Fiddimet life on the ranch. Grandpa's father-in-law was a very talented brick mason, and he did a lot to contribute to the ranch's success, he explained as we inspected the time-worn walls. Looking past the immediate house and buildings, David pointed to and described the places where a barn, turkey house, and blacksmith shop once stood. Then he spotted an object of peculiar interest a ways off in the field. It looked to be a very large copper pot, and he wanted to walk the distance to see if he could figure out just what it was. We reached the gigantic copper pot, and while he could identify the turkey cooling bin and a few other items close by, he wasn't able to recall just what that large pot was ever used for. Puzzled and looking a little defeated, he brightened when he spotted a small group of oak trees a little further in the distance. He said he wanted to walk among them. As we approached the shade of the old oaks, he gave me details about he and the other kids would come and play in this space. As we walked into the coolness under the canopy of the sprawling branches, his pace quickened, and he headed straight toward one of the big oaks as if it were his long-lost friend. This, he said, pointing out specific trees, was where we kids used to sit. My dad put a board in the fork of each of these trees, and we would use them as benches. Then he reminisced about younger, carefree days when he and his friends and cousins would sit under the trees and the tree canopy and play for hours. This group of old oaks was a special place, and it was good to be with him as he recalled his memories and smiled. His face was a reflection of a man longing once again for his youth, and at the same time loving the joys he had experienced throughout his life. That day, I vowed to take it all in with him.
Beautiful. Well, I'm going to read just a couple paragraphs from the introduction to motorcycling in California Central Valley. Really, the introduction does a kind of a chronological history of motorcycling, but more than anything, it shows how historical events affected motorcycling as a sport and a kind of lifestyle and a community. So I'll start after World War II. Veterans of the let me go back one more. The post-war era brought unprecedented prosperity and a growing blue-collar middle class to the heart of the valley, in stark contrast with the decade prior to the war. In the late 1940s and the 50s, former sailors and soldiers settled into civilian family life. Many chose inexpensive military surplus Harleys and recreational motorcycling to continue the camaraderie they had enjoyed during the war. Veterans of the European campaigns had been introduced to Triumphs and other brands overseas, which created interest in lighter motorcycles and contributed to the stripped-down bobber trend. And dealers such as Leonard Andrus and Glenn McGill provided motorcyclists with services, support, and equipment. Rosie the Riveters had acquired much independence during the World War II and sought their own freedoms and recreational expressions, with or without men. The Lodi Comet's all-women motorcycle club thrived in the 1950s, and its first president became a national spokesperson. The Tracy Gear Jammers Auxiliary was one of the 2 female-only clubs to attend the infamous 1947 Independence Day weekend gathering in Hollister. That AMA-sanctioned gypsy tour event was crashed by 100 non-affiliated troublemakers and was sensationalized by a pair of San Francisco reporters and Look magazine. The reporting spawned the Wild One movie in 1953 and fueled the outlaw biker mystique.
Good, thank you. So there's going to be one of these universal dings, so we're going to do early. So I am not going to read something called A Long Hot Summer's Walk to the Library, but I'm going to show it to Jill later because I think she'll appreciate it. The only reason that I'm showing this is to encourage you to write. I'm inviting everyone here to do that. Dave and I are on a committee to create a new history journal that is going to be produced by the Sacramento River Delta Historical Society, but it will be stories from throughout the region. And this is a prototype of what it will look like. And it's quite beautiful and stunning. What we're going to do a little differently is that we are going to have essays and images and poetry and book reviews. so that if there are important books, and then interviews that we're going to be doing with people, hopefully a lot of people here from the ACC, sharing those stories and then putting that into a format where it's written and people can see it. So we are inviting everyone here. If you have a story that you'd like to share, we can come here, or you can come down to the Delta where we are, but I'll start arranging that as well. We want to thank all of you. Is there one last question? Anybody from the audience before we close it up? We want to thank Ted and Sean and our speakers. Any questions? You have a statement you'd like to make? Okay, so Caesar.
I mentioned all those people who have inspired me, and coming to ACC has been an inspiration in itself. And speaking with Ted Fong here, and I told him some things, we talked, and so I wrote a couple of articles on the centenarians, and I'd just like to thank him for his vision of seeing a writer.
Oh, thank you.
Yes,
Thank you. Great. And I'm going to wrap it up by one really quick question, if everybody can answer it in 30 seconds or less. And for me, I identify as a writer. That is how I perceive myself. I used to call myself an artist, and I always felt like a fraud. But when I say writer, that feels better than if I say historian. So I'm just going to ask a quick question and it can be something totally different. How do you identify? What term do you use?
How do I identify with what I do?
Yeah.
Researcher, historian, but at the heart of it all, a writer, because it's always been there my entire life.
Good, Dave.
Yeah, to me it's wrapped up in anthropologist, storyteller, writer, little bit historian. I don't claim to be a trained historian, but they're all like threads of that are woven together.
Good. And how about you, Jill?
Librarian, poet, and grandmother.
I like that.
Good. And Caesar?
Writer.
Great. And thank you for the audience that came today and on Zoom. This will be on YouTube within minutes, practically. And if you are watching from Renaissance Society, we will make sure that we send you the link. Next, I think October 17th, Dave is going to be down at the Sacramento River Delta Historical Society in Walnut Grove telling the story of Ishi. Morning Coffee next month is going to be on funerary customs. It happens to be Day of the Dead, Dias de los Muertos. And I'm going to have some guests that have done altars themselves. We're going to show some samples of altars that'll be here, but we'll also talk about funerary customs in China, in Asia, in Africa, in Armenia, and almost everywhere. And we're going to have food as well. So please join us again. And thank you, Sean. Thank you, Ted.